to this episode of the Star Wars Universe Podcast. My name is Matthew Westfox. I'm your host. We're still going through a process of having a bunch of guests and hopefully moving towards a more regular co-host in time, but right now I'm really enjoying having different guests on to talk about all sorts of different parts of the Star Wars universe. And especially today, we're going to be talking about what has become one of my favorite parts of the Star Wars universe, and something that is not really talked about, and I think a lot of fans have not had a chance to see it. But as we record, we're about maybe 2 or 3 hours away from this show becoming fully accessible to anybody who has the Disney Plus universe, and we're talking therefore about the Clone Wars. So I'm really excited to be diving into it. Today we're going to kind of do an overview of the show. We're going to start with a spoiler-free section. So for anybody who hasn't seen it, but has been thinking about seeing the show, this is going to be a great time to kind of get a sense of what's so good about it, what are some of the problems with it, and why as a Star Wars fan you might really want to see it. And then after about 20 minutes or so, we'll go into a spoiler section and get into a lot more specifics, and that I think especially be good for whether you were a longtime Clone Wars fan or whether you never really liked the show or just want to hear more about it. I think this will be good for everyone. So with that, let me introduce my guest, is Matthew Donovan, a good friend of mine who's also a pretty hardcore Star Wars fan and was very excited to get the chance to talk about the Clone Wars, and is probably going to be back as well to talk about a couple of movies at another time. So, Donovan, let's start right there. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you doing?
Pretty well. I'm excited for this. So let's start by just jumping right in. And I will say that at a later point, myself and possibly Matt Donovan, possibly some others, are going to do a more thorough, in-depth look at the Clone Wars TV show, where we'll probably, maybe every other week, watch a bunch of episodes and then record on a specific group of episodes. But today we're just talking about the whole show overall. So, Matt, what made you really excited about this show and about wanting to talk about the Clone Wars?
I think for me, one of the things that I enjoyed the most about the Clone Wars is it actually enhanced the prequel movies for me. I was not a huge fan of the prequels. Over time, they just they didn't quite mesh together with the rest of the universe, and there's something about them that I just didn't like, and I discovered through watching the Clone Wars that I think a part of that issue I had was characters just didn't have the time to develop the way they needed to, and they were able to explore that a lot more in the Clone Wars series.
We've talked about, and I've talked on some of the earlier episodes, that one of my biggest frustrations with the prequels especially is there's so much character story that's needed, because we know where the characters and where the entire world is supposed to get by the start of the original movies, A New Hope. And the way at least the story is told in A New Hope, there's so much subtlety in that story. You know, the subtlety is involved in how Anakin becomes Darth Vader, or how the Chancellor who becomes the Emperor corrupts the Senate and how the Jedi fall, and how what's happening during the Clone Wars, and all these kind of stories. And I think, I'm not sure if you agree, but one of my biggest complaints with the prequels is that all those stories just feel very rushed and feel like they feel very ham-fisted. Is that something you think was a fair way to put it?
That's exactly was my issue. Like, for example, Revenge of the Sith was one I had a lot of issues with as I watched it. And even rewatching it in general, Anakin falls to the dark side very suddenly, and it seems like he went from being good guy to being full-blown evil very quickly. But one of the things that the Clone Wars series does is it gives this background so you can see how this is actually building and building and building, and when you watch Revenge of the Sith, that's when he snaps. It's not all of a sudden he made his decision, it's just everything cascaded down all of a sudden.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way to put it. There's just so much more richness to his story, as well as to a number of the other stories. Do you want to give just a quick, not kind of plot overview, but just kind of like a setting overview for those who haven't seen it? Like, what is the Clone Wars TV show about?
The Clone Wars TV show obviously follows along with the Clone Wars. It goes from after the end of Attack of the Clones, and kind of follows the intervening 3 or 4 years between that and Revenge of the Sith. It follows along with a bunch of the Jedi, so Obi-Wan Kenobi, Anakin Skywalker, and then a bunch of the actual clone soldiers as they go through and try to fight against Count Dooku, General Grievous, and a bunch of the Separatists.
Yeah. And I'm really glad you mentioned and it also introduces a couple of great new characters as well, including a new Jedi and some other Force users on other sides. One of the things that I really love, and I'm glad you brought it up, is the clone soldiers, because when I watched the second movie, I love Star Wars in part because of the ethical questions. For anyone who knows me from the Superhero Ethics podcast, this is not a surprise, but I'm interested in ethics. I'm interested in the questions that come up around. Star Wars is miles away from science fiction, but when you talk about clones and androids and things like that, questions like what is the value of their life come up. What is the value of their life? Those questions come up. And the movies never get into that. They just tell us that the someone else, it looks like probably the Separatists created this army, but the Jedi are happy to use them with very little moral compunction about what's happening. And in the Clone Wars TV show, I think some of my favorite plot lines are the ones about the clones and getting to know them as individual people and seeing how they become individual people and seeing the various attitudes they have towards the war. And I thought that's one of the best things because it really explores this issue of what does it do to sort of the moral heart of society and to the Jedi to be commanding this army of people that on some level they think of as purely expendable.
Yeah. And also is good because it fleshes it out. Like you were saying, it turns them into actual human beings as opposed to just being another tool that you can use in a chess game.
Yeah. That, I think, is a very good way to put it as well. So, I think for me, you hit a couple of things. I think one of the things that I also really love that the show explores is other uses of the Force. In the movies, we get very clearly the Jedi and the Sith, and for the first couple of movies, obviously, there's literally only 3 people using the Force. There's there's Luke, Obi-Wan, Darth Vader. I guess there's 5 because then there's also the Emperor and to some extent Leia.
Yep.
And in the prequels, we get a lot more, but we don't explore them, and certainly they're all very much within the Jedi or the Sith. In the TV show, we get introduced to all sorts of other characters, a lot of them who are more light sensitive, and some of them who are very much on the dark side, but have very intentionally kind of broken away from either of these, these two ideas of the only ways to use the Force and really explored some others. Yeah.
It did a very good job of expanding that. It was things that had existed in the Legends universe now, as it's called now. And it really just gives a lot of breadth to it beyond this very black and white view that they had with Jedi and Sith.
Right. So, and let's get into that a little. Oh, actually, we're gonna hold discussions of those questions themselves for the spoiler section. But just kind of doing more of the overview of that kind of thing. What are other kind of key elements of the story that explore that you really appreciated?
Well, again, going back to the clones, one of the things that was really interesting is, it's a war in which there are soldiers, and the show does a good job of establishing a lot of the clones as characters you like and you get to know because they have character personalities. Mm-hmm. And they don't all make it out. Spoiler alert. Minor spoiler alert, but it's neat to see that because a lot of shows, especially shows that are sensibly aimed at a younger audience, don't cover that. They just would, everyone survives and everything keeps going on, but this actually kind of brings more of the horror of the war to Star Wars.
I mean, it brings the horror of the war, and again, this show makes some political points about that.
Yeah.
Again, speaking pretty broadly, but there's a whole series of plot lines about where people within the Republic are starting to ask questions about why are we still fighting this war? Should we be fighting this war? Can we try to make peace? Do the Separatists maybe have some legitimate concerns? And it comes up that one of the people who are most sort of opposing those efforts are the people who are profiting from the war, the people who are selling the weapons that are being used in the war, who are otherwise, benefiting from the war. And I remember this show came out at the height of the Iraq War, and when there really was a lot of conversation about in Iraq and Afghanistan about who was profiting from it. And I remember being really surprised because that was a much more political point than I thought a show like this would make, and especially because it's not done, the the prequels are very clearly supposed to be in some ways a commentary on the Bush administration, but again, it's done in such a ham-fisted way.
Yeah.
Stuff like that, like you said, it's much more subtle in these shows.
Well, it's subtle, but it also presents itself in a way where it gets you to think about it, and I think one of the things that's really good about the show is it gets you to think about some of these ethical questions and some of these other issues that you might be, if someone just said, hey, I want you to think about what it's like to send soldiers into war, or some of the other issues that come up, you just be like, I don't know if I want to think about that, but it presents it to you in a way that it kind of eases you into it, and then you actually have to think about it.
Yeah. And what it does a lot that I really appreciate is I don't think it always gives us clear answers. I mean, no. I haven't, it's been about a year since I saw the show, but I certainly don't think it ever gave an exact answer on what is the moral weight of a clone or a droid, or how do you treat folks in war. It seemed like a lot of things that it left as open questions for the audience to discuss further.
Yeah.
It's funny too, because one of the things that I don't think it's the greatest show ever made. I think there's definitely some problems with it. And I loved what you said about how it seems to explore these things in a lot more depth than, you might think that if it was a kid's show. And part of my frustration with it is that is very true. And there's a lot that is so much deeper. There's also a lot of episodes that really just seem like they're straight out of a kid's show. Like, Did you have that same sense?
There were definitely some episodes where, or some plot arcs where we're going to focus on some of these other characters doing lighthearted adventures, and they're kind of silly, and it's a very different tone.
Yeah. In some ways, have you seen the TV show Batman the Animated Series?
Yes.
It reminds me a lot of that, in a show that is, I didn't watch Batman the Animated Series in many ways for the exact same reason I didn't watch the Clone Wars, because I thought it was for kids.
Oh, sure.
And I was really blown away when my friend Paul, who's often been a co-host and was the co-host of our first episode of this new podcast, he got me to watch both Batman and the Clone Wars. And it's funny, until you made that comment, I'd never thought about it this way. But I think that they both share that sense of, these are kids' shows, and sometimes there's an episode that reminds you it's a kids' show. But for the most part, it's exploring pretty deep, serious issues in ways that are accessible to kids, but in a lot more nuance and complexity, and willing to explore a lot of darkness that most kids' TV is not.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a comparison you would agree with?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And generally the tone is, again, these more kind of adult, or easing into the adult maturity, for those questions. But then also, there are some of these just random lighthearted episodes, and I enjoy them to a degree, but it's different tonally.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, there are definitely some that I enjoyed, especially because some of them come after some pretty serious stuff.
Yeah. And you need some of those just to break it up, so it's not always darkness.
Yeah, exactly. I'll say one other thing that I really appreciated is we get much more a sense of what is a day in the life like for people in this entire universe, but especially for people who aren't, we talked about how there's Force users who aren't part of the Jedi or the Sith. We also get to go to a lot of planets that are not part of either the Republic or the Separatists, and they just kind of want to be left alone. Mm-hmm. And some that, because they're not really high technology, and they think all of this is kind of silly. And others, like the Mandalorians, who are very high technology, but have really worked very hard to keep themselves out of it.
Yeah. Actually, just to build off of that, one of the things that I thought was really interesting and helped me understand the classic trilogy a little bit better, with the idea that there used to be all these Jedi in the prequels, and then by the time of A New Hope, they're kind of this urban legend that there used to be these great warriors who could do telekinetic things and read people's minds.
Right.
That disconnect always seemed a little weird to me. And then when they actually do the Clone Wars, they kind of do show that, number one, the galaxy is a very big place, but number two, your average citizen might see a Jedi fighting a Sith once in their life, or might have a friend of a cousin's neighbor who heard about this thing once, and that's the only exposure they'd have. It's not because in the movies, in the prequels, you follow around with the Jedi, so you see a bunch of Jedi. But, like, the average citizen, if they don't live on the Coruscant or one of the core worlds, would probably just never see them. And then it makes more sense that 20 years down the line, they have kind of just faded into this myth because they don't really exist in a way that people have interacted with them.
I have said before in an earlier episode that was one of my biggest complaints about the Phantom Menace is, like you said, in A New Hope, especially, the officers in the Empire talk to Vader as though, the Jedi are this long ago myth, and it kind of made me want the prequels to be set, 500 years ago, or at least at a time when most of the Jedi have died out. So I think that's a good point. I do still think it doesn't make sense simply because, the Clone Wars established that the Jedi are fighting alongside the Republic soldiers and the clones.
Mm-hmm.
And, especially in that one particular scene in A New Hope, when it is Imperial officers who are talking to Vader about how the Jedi are a dying religion, a dead religion that no one knows anything about. Like, those were people who would have fought alongside the Jedi back in the Clone Wars, So that part threw me some, but I think I like the explanation you're giving because it at least helps us to better understand why someone like Han Solo, for example, would probably have just never experienced a Jedi at all until he meets Obi-Wan, and so just have no ability to understand what the Force is. Because you're right, like, unless there was a specific battle on your planet, like, if there's maybe like 100, 200 Jedi in the world, or maybe even like 1,000 Jedi in the world, compared to trillions of beings in the universe on millions of planets, then yeah, you're right. The chance of most people experiencing the Jedi as anything but myth is probably very small.
Yeah, like, one of the things I thought about when I first came to this realization is, like, if we think of, like, great historical figures that have existed in our lifetime, like Mother Teresa. We've heard about her and we know that she did wonderful things, but, like, I don't know anyone who's even met her, and that's just, like, she's one person out of a couple billion, and then just try to expand this to a galaxy size. Like, that's that type of thing.
Well, but, I mean, could the example, I don't think, in a totally different discussion, I would argue that I think Mother Teresa did some pretty horrible things, but that's another discussion entirely. But I would say, I wonder though if that kind of disproves your point, because you and I though both know that she existed. We don't have any doubt that she existed.
Right.
There's a lot of things from 50 years ago that I have never experienced, but I certainly believe they exist, or did exist, and I guess that's maybe a little bit of a counterpoint, is because it's still, like, there is that much technology still existing in the world, and people would have still, heard stories from their dads about the Jedi existing. But you are at least right that they wouldn't have had that personal contact.
Well, just like, kind of think of it this way, like, the average, like, Imperial officer could believe that there were people who were called Jedi, but they might not necessarily believe that they could, like, move things with their minds, or could, like, read your thoughts or something like that. They could think that this was just some sort of propaganda campaign. And,
yeah,
like,
actually, that's a really good point.
In the same way, like, all the, like, recent saints who have been selected by the Vatican or whatever, like, they've done miracles, so we're told, but if you're not there to see it yourself, then how much is this is really miraculous, and how much of this is what someone said and then maybe embellished a little bit?
Yeah. That's you've actually helped give me a perspective on an issue that I've been ranting about quite a lot in some of the earlier episodes. So
cool.
that's a good one. I still think it could have been done better in The Phantom Menace, but you're right. This is one more way in which this show really helps to give a better perspective on it. And I definitely had the same experience you did of this show makes the prequels better for me.
Yeah.
Just because it, like you said, it bridges the gap of Anakin's character, it bridges the gap of the fall of the Jedi and the fall of the Republic. It really just fills in those gaps, and it doesn't change the awful dialogue of the second and third movies and the first movie. It doesn't make Jake Lloyd a better actor. But I do think that it like you're right, it smooths out some of that and it fills in some of those gaps.
It gives the context that you need to kind of accept the abrupt change between the prequels and the classic trilogy, because they feel like very different worlds, but with seeing what you see in the Clone Wars, it kind of makes sense.
Yeah. I'll also say that, I don't know if this is true for you, I commented this on the first episode where we talked about kind of all of our favorite movies in order. I love The Last Jedi, and I know it's controversial and not everybody loves it. And putting aside the, really dumb reasons that some dude bros don't like it, but, there's I can understand legitimate reasons to not like it. I don't think I would have liked it anywhere near as much if it wasn't for the Clone Wars TV show.
I agree completely. Like, can we talk, spoilers about The Last Jedi, or do you want to stick away from that right now?
Yeah, well, actually, why don't we do that? Why don't we now move into a spoiler section? For those who haven't seen the show yet, or haven't seen some of the later movies like Last Jedi, you're certainly welcome to stick along. We're at a point in our culture where it seems like a lot of the major plot points have been spoiled in one way or another. But if not, certainly feel free to hit pause. A good podcast file, a good podcast player will keep it on pause at this exact time for years on end if need be. Go watch the stuff you want to watch, and then come back. For everyone else, we'll go into the spoiler section in 3, 2, 1. Vader is Luke's father. Spoiler. Anyway, so yeah, what did you want to say? Now we're in the spoiler section. What do you want to say about Last Jedi?
So yeah, the thing that I really liked about The Last Jedi is that Luke specifically calls out that the Jedi are flawed individuals. They were human beings or other humanoid beings. They were people who were still subject to the mistakes that people can make. And he calls out, when Rey is asking him, he's like, no, the Jedi weren't actually that great of people. We just have idolized them in their absence. And It's one of those things where I would think maybe that's a little bit unfair to say if I just watched the movies. But watching the Clone Wars, you really get a sense of the Jedi aren't necessarily corrupt, but they're not they're not perfect, and they're not able to make the absolute objectively correct decision all the time. And they make a lot of questionable decisions in probably what's in the name of the greater good, but that causes a lot of problems and leads directly to Anakin's fall to the dark side, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's true, especially because I would say it leads to Anakin's fall to the dark side. And just to a lesser extent, I would argue it leads to somewhat the Jedi's fall. Maybe not all the way to the dark side, but sort of away from their ideals, And, and that can get into another discussion about, how realistic are the Jedi ideals, and is there some extent that you'd always fall from those ideals. But I think one of the things that the Clone Wars really explores well is, some of their, the whole idea of being peace, they are the guardians of peace and justice in the galaxy.
Mm-hmm.
What happens?
Then the characters Satine specifically raises the hypocrisy of how can you be a warrior of peace? That doesn't work.
I just did a rewatch of Phantom Menace, and there's a moment in that movie where Qui-Gon says to Queen Amidala that he can help protect her, but he cannot fight a war for her. Because the implication being the Jedi are not supposed to fight wars. Mm-hmm. And by Clone Wars, the Jedi are generals. They are fighting wars. And some of my favorite episodes are where you really start to see the way that is kind of creating a moral rot within the Jedi. I didn't get a chance to look up exact episode numbers and stuff like that, so you might know this better than I do. But do you remember there's an episode, or maybe a couple, an arc of episodes, where it focuses on a Jedi who's a general of the clones, but has really kind of lost sight of the fact that the clones are still people, and and basically just treating them like pieces on a chessboard to try and, because he's so obsessed with winning a particular battle.
Well, it's that. Well, so you're thinking of the Darkness on Umbara arc.
Yes,
and it's I want to say it's like a 3 or 4 episode arc. But it's that, but also he's kind of become corrupted himself, where he just wants to do what is good for him rather than what's good for everyone. But yeah, he sees them as tools to do a thing. He does not see them as individuals, and it's really scary.
Yeah, and I think to me, we could do an entire episode just on what is the moral worth of a clone, and I think we'll talk about it more in just a few minutes. But I think one of the things that it really shows is that he at least has just lost any sense of that, and that letting clones die is something that he's totally okay with at this point.
Oh, it's that, and also there's the nice juxtaposition too with the clones who are number one thinking we have to follow the chain of command. He's our commander, even when they disagree with his tactics, or they are like, he is just going to get us all killed. Right. And then even at the end of the arc, when they have figured out that he's a traitor, he's become corrupted, and this guy is a huge threat to them, and they still, majority of them still are refusing to actually harm him or anything like that. Like, that's interesting that they're the merciful ones, even though they're these hardened warriors.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I did not take it away as mercy. And granted, have you read any of the books in case particularly the Republic Commando books?
No, I have not.
So, and granted, those books are not part of the official canon anymore, but I still think that there's nothing been done that overrides them. And the Republic Commando's books, they're not huge plot points. They're very much day in the life type books.
Okay.
But one thing that they really go into is the idea that, these people are not people who had 18 years of a traditional childhood and then were drafted or volunteered to go into the military. Most of them are like between 4 and 14 years old.
Yep.
And their only purpose that they've ever been given in life is to be part of the military and to be part of the chain of command. And part of it, I think you're right, there's a merciful aspect, but there's also an aspect of it is just so absolutely hardwired into these people.
So it's not something that they could even do.
Yeah, exactly. And that raises other questions as well. It's like, what is it, the Jedi have basically created, or at least are helping to now foster and create this race of slaves who don't even have any idea of an existence outside of being these military figures. What are other moments where you think you really start to see like the Jedi starting to fall in the show?
I think one of the good ones, and like one of the really cool story arcs overall, was the Obi-Wan fakes his death and becomes a bounty hunter arc. Which is one of the coolest ones overall. I've heard one of my favorite YouTubers, Cosmonaut Variety Hour, mentioned that like when he talks about the Clone Wars series, that this is one of those story arcs that you could not have known you wanted until you see it. But the thing that's interesting in that is there's this massive conspiracy among the high-ranking Jedi to have Obi-Wan fake his death and then become a bounty hunter to try and unravel this plot to assassinate the Chancellor. And they don't tell Anakin because it might compromise the mission. But they really should do that. Like, on a humane level, like, these people were, like, best friends. And Anakin is also a little bit more emotional than your average Jedi. So maybe that would be good to let him know that one of his really good friends was not just murdered.
Right. Well, and especially if you think about the whole idea of the Jedi, like in theory, again, if they're supposed to be, upright and true and trustworthy, it's kind of like it's kind of like Gryffindor starting to take on Slytherin tactics, And I say that as a proud Slytherin, but that whole story arc of the amount of deceit that's involved, especially towards other Jedi, it helps their overall mission. But I'm not really sure how much it plays into the Jedi ideals.
Yeah. Well, and it's again one of those things that does kind of highlight that the Jedi are fallible, number one. And number two, like, I really like the story arc from the side of you can see why Anakin distrusts the Jedi Council, and it makes sense. It doesn't seem like it's fabricated. It seems like it's actually very justified now when you see it in Episode 3, where he's just like, no, these people have lied to me a bunch, and they have all these rules, but they don't follow these rules themselves.
Yeah, I in light of some of the recent conversations the world has been having, I imagine there's going to be some moments where, when I rewatch those second and third movies, and especially when I watch the Clone Wars, when Anakin is talking to some of the older Jedi, and I'm really just going to want him to say, "Okay, Boomer," because it's very much that dynamic, and it's especially because I think the lack of trust makes a lot of sense on both sides, and in many ways, I've said this on other episodes of this podcast, but the first and most important reason why I've always loved Star Wars, I love the space battles and the lightsabers and the plot and the characters, but I so love the moral world that it builds of this idea of, hate and fear and distrust, even for the best of reasons, can lead in a really dark way.
Yeah.
And I think the cycle that happens with Anakin and the Jedi is exactly that. That they start distrusting each other, which makes them both start acting cagier towards each other, which makes them both start distrusting each other further, and eventually leads to, among other, and again, the third movie is kind of clumsy in how this shows it, but throughout the Clone War TV shows, Chancellor Palpatine is the one who Anakin feels like he can go to, is the one who Anakin, like, he is so perfectly manipulating this.
Yeah.
Because the Jedi are making it so easy to manipulate.
He makes himself into a great mentor and confidant and a friend outside of work that he can talk to.
Yeah.
And he does a very good job of steering and manipulating Anakin with his words to say, I don't know why they would do that. They surely must trust you more than that, and this must be in your head.
Right.
And plays up that kind of that paranoia in Anakin such that by the time things actually are ready to bubble over, then it's like a house of cards that's just falling in on itself all of a sudden.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very good way to put it. Interesting also, when you mentioned Obi-Wan, there's one other very Obi-Wan related plot point that I think is actually part of the Bounty Hunter storyline, or maybe another time where Obi-Wan is involved with the Mandalorians. But is the fact that it is very clear in the show that Obi-Wan encounters this woman who I think she's the princess of the Mandalorians, or she's
the Empress.
Empress, thank you.
Satine.
And she is very clearly romantically interested in him.
Mm-hmm.
And he is very clearly tempted.
Oh, he was tempted. They actually say that explicitly. That he was willing to leave the Order, but then they decided not to pursue it.
Well, and to me, that just, one of the things that I hate so much in the second and third movie is that we really push this idea of the Jedi as celibate, perfectly aesthetic, like they never have any human emotions, they never have any connections to anyone. Mm-hmm. And it's always presented as though Anakin is the only one who's ever had trouble with that.
Yeah.
And so the way the Clone Wars makes it seem to me is, if even someone is like Obi-Wan, who is, for the most part, him and Yoda are presented as two of the least sort of fallen of the Jedi in the show. And that if even he can be tempted like this, if even he wrestles with this idea of the Jedi, that maybe it's kind of a dumb idea. And it goes again to me to the hypocrisy of how strongly he and the rest of the Jedi come out against Anakin for his feelings for Padme.
I mean, there's two ways of looking at it, because there's the way that you're looking at that, and I agree strongly that it does kind of reveal some of the hypocrisy and also some of the humanness of the Jedi. I'm just going to use human, even though they're not all humans. But the other way to look at it too is how I see Obi-Wan and Satine versus Anakin and Padme as foils, and you can see when someone who has great power as a Jedi overcomes this temptation for attachment and belonging with someone, versus when someone actually pursues that and has to keep it secret and lets that develop in that way. Right. How those diverge, because Obi-Wan ends up remaining a fairly virtuous and good character overall, whereas this kind of consumes Anakin.
No, I do see it more like that second way, but I guess what I'm saying is, I feel like, in a more sensible world, Obi-Wan might have, when Anakin first starts to have these feelings and Obi-Wan realizes it, Obi-Wan might have been able to go to Anakin and say, hey, listen, I get it. I had these feelings too. Let me tell you about how close I came and why I decided to stay, and therefore, I do think you should stay, and here's why. I feel like if you'd been able to really relate to him on that kind of a level, but instead, what we're given is that because of the fact that, the Jedi are still so my sense is that the Jedi don't even want to admit that. Obi-Wan would never admit that, because it's not that you're supposed to be human and feel that desire and just be able to overcome it. Is that you're supposed to never have that desire. And so Obi-Wan can never admit that he did, and so when Anakin does, he doesn't have anyone he can talk to.
No, I agree with you on that the Jedi seem to, even though we see in the series that they have these feelings and things like that, they try not to talk about it. And it actually is one of the things that I think is interesting that distinguishes Anakin as a Jedi as well, because when he has his Padawan Ahsoka Tano, he is way more candid with her than we ever see Anakin be, or Obi-Wan be with Anakin.
Yeah.
He often kind of intimates that he thinks a bunch of these rules are dumb, but we gotta follow them.
Right.
And but he doesn't gloss over that no, this is dumb, or this is going to get people killed, so I'm choosing not to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Obi-Wan, and like the other Jedi, but especially it's surprising that Obi-Wan is very much by the book, we have to do it by the book.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, especially because, and it kind of leads into the next big thing I want to talk about, which is the way in which the show explores people who use the Force outside of just the Jedi and the Sith.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the things that I love so much is that, for those who've seen the show, Ahsoka is the Jedi apprentice for most of the show, and Ventress is not an apprentice by any means, but starts out as kind of the apprentice to what's Dooku's Jedi Sith name? Tyrannus.
Tyrannus, yeah.
That she's the apprentice to him, and then later she becomes this unconnected dark Jedi who's part of the Blood Witches. And what I love is that by the end of the show, she has become very disaffected with all of the dark side people. Ahsoka has become very disaffected with the Jedi and all of their people, and the two of them kind of go off together.
Yeah, well, they have similar experiences, and they kind of come together in kind of this middle ground between the two extreme ideologies.
Yeah. Like, I know that with Disney Plus that there's a whole bunch of new content that's going to be created. I would really love if we got an animated show about those two characters going on, especially because they're going to have their adventures, like, as, Order 66 is being carried out, and as the Empire's taking over, and kind of watching them go on the run and figure out how do they want to relate to this whole new world. I think it'd be such interesting stories to tell there.
Yeah. Ventress was a very interesting character the entire time through, because you can get the sense that she was raised and trained to be evil in the way that she is, but she's not necessarily inherently an evil person.
Right.
And, like, one of the things I like in a lot of media is watching people who are flawed and terrible try to become less terrible. Mm-hmm. And that's something that you get to see with her, especially as she gets betrayed by Tyrannus, to see, like, her journey to find her who she actually is.
Right. Well, especially in that, I think, it is easy to see the Star Wars movies as, the good guys against the mustache-twirling, evil, cackling bad guys. And certainly Emperor Palpatine is very much a, evil, cackle, quite literally kind of bad guy.
Yeah.
But, even Darth Vader is shown that, like, especially when we learn about Anakin, he has his own motivations. And I love what you're saying about both the character who's been bad trying to do better, but related to that, I also like the character who, to our moral standards, looks pretty bad, but within their own moral framework, they think that what they're doing is justified.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, this is the Magnetos of the world, the Killmongers of the world, and I think it's very much Ventress, because, as we learn through the show, we get so much of her backstory and how her people have been oppressed, and, she doesn't think she's doing good necessarily, but she does think she's doing justice, and she thinks she is protecting herself and the people she cares about and the ideals she cares about. And I love that too, because there are some moments where Ventress makes points, and I'm like, I'm not sure you're wrong, and I don't know how I feel about that.
Well, those are the best kind of antagonists who, number one, are clearly the heroes of their own stories, and that's what makes them believable. But also, they raise good points, like Killmonger did. Like, it's really great when you have an antagonist who raises moral points, and you're like, I think you're actually right on this one, and maybe my perception has been wrong, but you're maybe still doing super evil things.
Yeah. and I'll say, it's one thing that I really actually love about the show as well, is that in some ways it has such a wonderful rogues gallery, if you know what I mean by that. Because, there are a number of different antagonists who have so many different moral perspectives. There's, Sidious and Tyrannus and Dooku and Grievous, who clearly just want, to be evil for evil's sake and take everything over. There's people like Ventress and some others who are, doing some pretty horrible things and for ideals that we don't believe in, but clearly they believe in those ideals. There are people even though, in one of the things that I hate most, the second movie establishes the idea that Dooku doesn't actually believe in the separatist movement in the slightest, we certainly meet many people who do. And people who have very valid arguments about why the Republic is wrong and why they want to fight in the separatist army.
Yeah.
And then you just get, the Hutt type people and the gamblers and the scoundrels who don't care about any of these political ideas. They just want to make a buck.
Yep.
And I love this show presents all of them as antagonists and it shows our heroes have to kind of deal with, like, what's the difference and how am I allowed to fight against someone who literally wants to take over the galaxy versus someone who's just trying to make a buck. It doesn't matter if he kills some people along the way, or someone like Ventress or any of those others.
And then you also have a couple other antagonists like Boba Fett and I had for a second there, Darth Maul, who just want to they're seeking justice for the way they've been wronged, and they're out to remind the main characters that they have wronged them, and they're going after them not because they want to necessarily take over the entire galaxy or something like that, but because they want to get vengeance for their losses.
Right. Yeah, and in some ways those like Darth Maul, it's kind of hard for me to argue that he was, terribly wronged. But some of the others certainly, and certainly like, to me, I think one of the most fascinating characters is, what's the name of Darth Maul's brother?
Savage Opress.
Savage, yeah, who is, literally, he's from the same planet as Darth Maul. I don't think he's literally Darth Maul's brother, but they're treated as brothers.
They're from the same clan or something like that, I believe.
Exactly, yeah. And it's kind of like they're the male equivalent to the blood. You're so much better with this than I am.
The Dathomir Force Witches are the women, and there's some like brotherhood name or something like that for the males, but I don't remember what it is.
And this is obviously a very like kind of hard planet and a very kind of like dark planet, but it's it's a clan, it's a community, and he is without any real he kind of has a choice, but to some extent he's pretty much forced to become a Sith apprentice when Darth Tyrannus needs a new one. Mm-hmm. And then he later realizes, like, he's been being horribly manipulated and treated. And then, in some ways, he's a character who I have more sympathy for than almost anyone else, because his entire existence is just having all of these feelings, all these emotions, all this power, and just everyone in his life manipulates him horribly. First it's Tyrannus, and then it's Darth Maul, and even before then it was the Queen Mother. Like, everyone just, he never gets to kind of just do his own thing.
I never really thought about him in that way, but you're right.
So let's shift a little bit to what's obviously one of the central, like the thing the whole thing is named after is the Clone Wars, and it's one of the central plot lines of the whole show. What's your take on how that storyline is handled in terms of like the war and the way the role it plays in the show and the questions it brings up throughout the show?
So one of the things that I liked, the way it kind of goes over the whole overarching war and stuff like that, is does a very good job of showing how Sidious had kind of was pulling the strings the entire time, helping both sides and setting up things such that they would just have huge losses and have great just these terrible things happen such that they could eventually use that to justify oppression of other people and stuff like that.
Right. Like,
it's one of those things where, like, you don't necessarily think of how could we get into this weird authoritarian government that we see by the time of A New Hope, but it makes sense how things gradually eroded freedoms in the name of the greater good or wartime emergencies, and just kind of it does a good job of that.
I think that's very true, and especially because for me, one of my biggest frustrations with the movie Attack of the Clones is I never quite understand what's so bad about separatists wanting to break away from the Republic. Mm-hmm. And I never quite understand what their grievances are. And what I like that the show really explores both of those questions further, because on the one hand, it does really get deeper into the reasons, like, as I said again, Dooku obviously doesn't care, he's just helping Sidious. But that clearly there are quite a lot of people who have very legitimate grievances with the Republic and feel like the Republic isn't what they need to be and they want to be separate from it.
Yeah.
At the same time, though, showing that a lot of those people are being very manipulated by some folks like Sidious, and then some folks like the Trade Federation or the Banking Guild that are just trying to make a buck. I love the moral complexity there, because it shows that there are, in this whole group of separatists, that there's so many different reasons for it. And then also from the Republic side, that yes, there's some good reasons why to fight against the separatists. But it also, to me, again, shows that kind of moral decay, that the Republic, both the Republic and the Jedi, have gotten to a point where they think they need to exist without really understanding why they need to exist, and so something that challenges them has to be stopped. And I love some of the later episodes where Padme and some of the other characters start to really question, like, wait, why are we fighting this? Why can't we make peace? Why is it so bad if they want to leave the Republic?
Well, it's one of the things where I've rewatched the show a couple times, and like on the last couple rewatches, with the very divisive nature of United States politics right now, it's one of the things where I can better understand how it's possible for the average citizen to have like very strong beliefs and like very reasonable beliefs, and also have them being co-opted by the leaders of political parties.
Yeah.
Because that's clearly what happens in the Clone Wars on both sides to a degree, but that's definitely on the side of the Confederacy.
Yeah.
And like, it's one of those things where like, when you get to meet the actual Confederate citizens, they are reasonable and they like have reasonable beliefs, but they're just being horribly, horribly manipulated by the people on top, who are horribly, horribly corrupt.
Right. Yeah, I mean, certainly I think the like I said, the Trade Federation, the Banking Guild, they just want a better financial stake in things, and people like Sidious and Tyrannus who just want the conflict.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, and the banking guilds and stuff like that, they are actually engineering it such that they will be able to force both governments into financial collapse and owe them all their money or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, that was a really interesting plot line, which, if you had told me would be an interesting plot line before I watched the show, I would be like, I'm not going to care about galactic banking laws and interest rates. Yeah, but they presented it in a very interesting way.
Exactly. And I remember, like, I just did the episode about Phantom Menace, and one of the things I talked about was, I thought the scenes in the Republican Senate were handled so ham-fistedly and so sloppily. And it just made the whole idea of, the scenes by the third movie when Chancellor becomes the Emperor, it just didn't make any sense at all. And again, here, the Clone Wars really shows it, because it makes you care about the bureaucracy. It makes you care about this internal power fighting within the Senate. And I like that it also really introduces characters like Bail Organa, the person who's Leia's adopted father, and other, we get to know not just a number of Jedi and a number of fighters, but a number of senators become pretty important characters, and you realize that they have different motivations and different ideas, and that they're not all on the same side, even if they're all part of the Republic and they're all working for the Republic.
Yeah, and it's actually, again, it's one of those things where it does a greater service to the movies in general to establish these characters, because Bail Organa is barely introduced in the prequels. He's there, but unless you are paying enough attention, you might not understand who he is. But now you get an understanding of, number one, who Bail Organa is, and number two, why people like him and why he would be an inspirational leader to a rebellion. Yeah,
exactly. And therefore why his daughter picking up the mantle becomes so important.
Yeah.
And I think that's such a good thing. So we've gone a good while. I want to kind of see if there's one or two other topics we want to touch on. Is there any other kind of big things from the show? Like I said, we're going to do a more of a plot arc by plot arc exploration later. But is there any other kind of like big overarching ideas that you wanted to touch on in terms of stuff that you thought the show really did well, or that maybe you're not as happy with?
For me, one of the things that I really liked about the Clone Wars is it's all about Anakin, because the way Anakin is portrayed in the Clone Wars is just significantly stronger than it is in the movies, and I think it's because you are able to spend more time with him. But like, the big thing that I felt in this is Anakin's a big hero, and you like him because he's not quite full on Jedi, and he's a bit more towards like what what with our Western ideals, what we would think a hero would be. He's got great power. He wants to help as many people as he can. He wants to help as much as he can. And then you can see how this doesn't necessarily work with having superpowers, where eventually you get into these morally gray areas and you start making compromises. And the other thing that I like that they did really well is they kind of show how Anakin is a good, upstanding Jedi, and then slips every now and then when the cards are on the table and he has to do something big to be a hero. Like there's the episode on the starship where there's the terrorist who's going to blow up the ship, and Obi-Wan and Satine are there, and Satine is the pacifist, so she doesn't want to. She has a weapon and she could kill the assassin, but she doesn't want to betray her ideals. And he's taunting Obi-Wan, and Obi-Wan's like, Obi-Wan could easily kill him, but then he would betray the woman that he loves. And then Anakin just comes in and is like, hey, I got a lightsaber, I'm gonna cut you in half. It was easy.
Yeah.
Or seeing that, or like the one later on, I think it was when Ahsoka's wrongly accused in the 5th or 6th season. I think it's the 5th season. And you see him force choke someone. And you just see all these things like this. You can see how he kind of falls into where he ends up in episode 3 and how he can be seduced by the dark side. Because you can see that he just kind of, he makes mistakes and falls slightly to the dark side and then goes, oh, nope, and then tries to be a Jedi, but he can't be a good Jedi because the Jedi ideology is just kind of flawed.
It's such a good point, because I think, like, it would have been so easy for the writers to just say he is the morally rebellious Jedi, the Jedi with the dark side, and make him that for 6 seasons. Mm-hmm. But instead, I think it's a fantastic job of writing. They very meticulously show this slow descent, to where I think if Anakin had force choked someone in season 1 of the show, it would have felt weird. But by the 6th season, you believe it. You believe that's what he would do, and you start to. It's his attachment. He has very strong feelings, not romantic in the slightest, but he has really fatherly, older brother feelings towards Ahsoka, and so he wants to protect her, and he's falling. Like,
the thing that I think they established really well in the Clone Wars is that Anakin's one real character flaw is that he cares too much about the people he cares about.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it's one of those things where, like, when you see him force choke someone in that season, it just makes sense, and you're kind of thinking, no, this is kind of justified, which is scary.
Yeah, and I would add, I think it's actually 2 flaws. I think one is that he cares too much, but the other is, and I say this because I think it's important to stress because I think it's so relatable. Unfortunately, so much of his ego and so much of his idea of his own self-worth is wrapped up in his ability to protect others.
Oh, sure.
And I think that's something that I will say that the second movie gets into that somewhat, but again, that the show just does so well.
Yeah, it nails it. It hammers the nail really well for that.
Yeah. There's one other point on the war also that I want to make that I think you really started to get into, where you're saying that, like, to some extent, like, the Jedi are falling, and Anakin especially, because of the compromises you have to make in war, and that it's all kind of showing the Jedi's flawed ideology. I think, to me, one of the things that the show demonstrates is that one of the most brilliant things that Palpatine, Darth Sidious, does is he realizes what the flaws are in the Jedi, and he realizes that the thing that will most expose those failures in their ideology and most expose the hypocrisy and most kind of set them spiraling in a downward path is war.
Yeah.
And I think it does such a, it's such a cliche that, like, war corrupts everyone it touches, but I think it's so true. And it's funny, until some of what you said, I'd never really put that all together in this kind of a thinking, but I think that the show gets into, and that Sidious very clearly knows, is if the Jedi can't hold their ideals if they want to win the war. And so they kind of need an Anakin, and they need other people who bend the rules, and that's where it all starts to fall apart.
Yeah. I'd actually heard a really interesting thing the other day, and I'm not sure if this was fan theory or if this is actually, like, canon in books or something like that, but the argument that they had made was that Anakin was trained as a Jedi and was allowed to be trained as a Jedi, even though Sidious knew he wanted Anakin as an apprentice later on, so that Anakin could learn the Jedi ideology fully, but it would never quite take. And since he would always be kind of against the grain, he could have this anger and resentment build up towards the Jedi, and then by the time that he was ready to become Sidious's apprentice, he would just be full-on ready to burst, because he knows that the Jedi are flawed and hypocrites, and he'd be willing to tear that down in a way that you can't train a child to do. You can't teach a child that type of hate.
Yeah. I think that gets into some really great questions, and especially it gets into questions like of just how far-reaching was Sidious's plan. You know, I think the way the movies and even the TV show presents it is that Sidious may have known that someone like Anakin was going to come along. There's even some, if you take like a couple lines from the third movie and pair it with some stuff in the books, there's some idea that maybe Darth Plagueis, who, according to the books at least, is Sidious's mentor, that he kind of set in motion the idea of the Force creating a life that would be Anakin. And so I think you could see this all as, Palpatine picks Naboo in part because of, how close it is to Tatooine, and he already knows Anakin is there. I don't think you can go quite that far, in part because, Palpatine picks Naboo because that's where he's from, but also just because I don't think there's evidence to think that I think when he realizes who Anakin is, all of a sudden his plans shift. He's like, oh, this is perfect. This is just the tool I needed.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure he knew about Anakin when it all got started, but
no. But I mean more for like, as soon as he sees him, he's like, oh, this is the one. Yeah. He'll do just fine.
And because I'm sure he was already thinking, even if it wasn't quite as bad as Anakin, there was still some black sheep in the Jedi Temple he could find, Yeah. Because I think you're right. It's such a good, resentment is such a good emotion for someone to play on if you really want to manipulate them and turn them, and just that. And it's funny because, like you said, that's what's happening in our country right now, is you have people who, for some decent reasons of economic reasons and for some kind of really racist or sexist or homophobic issues, have a lot of resentment about what's happening in the country. And a political party that has just been very, very good at whispering all the things in their ear, just like Palpatine does. It's so funny to me to think that like the people who make, and I know it's not the exact same writers, but it's not like that Lucas had control of it all. Like the people who wrote all this incredible complexity into the Clone Wars TV show are also the people who somehow allowed the line "I don't like sand" to appear on screen. It's just. It's the highs and the lows, but it's one of the reasons why just the Clone Wars is just so good.
Well, they say you can't have the light without the dark, so. Yeah.
Did you have any kind of major quibbles with the show, or things that you kind of wished had been done differently, or looking back on it that kind of left a bad taste in your mouth?
There were some dumb episodes in there. Like, I didn't like the Droid Squad episodes with R2 eating that. I kind of felt like that was a waste of my time. I personally like the Jar Jar episodes because I am a weirdo. Okay. But I understand a lot of people don't like those ones as well.
I will say that I find Jar Jar in the show far less offensive.
Yeah.
In part because they give him a more... they really play up the idea that Jar Jar becomes the Emperor's lackey because he is so dumb and so easily manipulatable that he, especially as the senator from Naboo, becomes very easy for the emperor, to the future emperor, to get him to do dumb things.
Yeah, and also I like that they do play it up in such a way that like all of the characters are aware of how like inept he is, but they understand that they need to work with him, and they do so. Like my favorite episode is the one where it's Jar Jar and someone else is going to talk with Jabba or one of the Hutts, and they get shot down, and through some terrible confluence of events, Jar Jar Binks is the highest ranking person on the ship, so all of the clone soldiers who are fighting for their lives and to protect him have to follow his orders, and they have to kind of suggest the commands to him. But also Jar Jar is aware that he's not good at this. Yeah. Like, it's not like he is unaware that he's not tactically savvy. He knows that he's not too, and there's just like this dance where they're trying to be polite and not overstep, but they're trying to be like, no, but really, what am I supposed to do?
Yeah. No, I think you're right. Those were a great set of episodes, and made that character a lot more interesting.
Were there things that left a bad taste in your mouth from the Clone Wars series?
I think a lot of the kind of sillier episodes, although it was in part because the episodes are short, they're like 20 minutes, and it is a very good show, and there is a lot of subtlety and depth, but there's also a lot of filler.
Yeah.
So it's a very good show to have on while you're doing things. And it was often the show that I had on while I was doing like physical like laundry or dishes or stuff like that. And there'd be like a 5-minute pause when some really important scene would happen. I would stop. But there were definitely some filler episodes. I felt like some plot lines, there's a couple of episodes where they go deeper to explore kind of the nature of the Force and the nature of the light side and the dark side. And I haven't seen them in a couple of years, and it's part of why I want to do the rewatch. I don't remember exactly, but I remember having the feeling of like, I wish they'd pushed it just a little bit further. I wish they'd gone a little deeper on that question.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like just to kind of like, I think it's just because it to some extent, like they go to a planet where sort of like the very embodiment of the light side and the very embodiment of the dark side they meet. And I guess here's part of it is I want to know more of, does the Force naturally have a light side and a dark side? Or is the Force a much more amorphous thing and just that like, sentient beings have gravitated to these two poles with all that stuff all that room in the middle as well? So I remember being a little frustrated by that, and I remember also, I think there's some other episodes where I always felt like, okay, they took it pretty far, but I wish they'd gone just a little bit deeper. I think especially in terms of the, we did talk about how there's a lot of separatists who are introduced who have very good reasons to want to be separatists.
Yeah.
But we also still get an awful lot of, just pure financial manipulation, and I wished we had had more people who were more of the, like, they're capitalists and they're not the most ethical of people by any means, but like,
they're not outright evil.
Yeah, instead of being outright evil, like, bankers who had started to feel like that, the trade, restrictions put in by the Republic were really limiting them and limiting their ability to like bring, economic, cause I think there's a great story of the Republic, of it being a republic that really started to focus more on the inner worlds and not paying attention to the economic needs of the outer worlds,
oh yeah, and I think that's like what they kind of hint as the causes of things, but they don't. I agree. I don't think they go deep enough into that.
Yeah, for sure. And some of that, a lot of that again goes back to my initial frustrations. It's one of the reasons why I'm so angry at the movie Attack of the Clones. Is for me, any hope I had of wanting to see that movie again ended with the scene where Darth Sidious Count Dooku shows that he's been working for Palpatine the whole time. Because to me, I'd be so much more interested in a story where Dooku fundamentally believes he's doing the right thing. He fundamentally believes in his cause, and he just doesn't have any idea how badly he's being manipulated. Especially if he's a Jedi and he fundamentally believes what he's saying. And then this guy Sidious comes along and says, listen, I know you always feared the dark side, but remember how much you hated the Jedi and thought the Jedi were so wrong. What if I can help you lead your separatists and break away from the Republic? That would have been so good.
So, like, one of the things that I've heard, and I don't know if it's speculation by fans or if it's actually something that's confirmed, but, like, one of the things I've heard is that Dooku is actually just a different angle in this entire thing, and he truly believes that the Jedi Order has become corrupt, but the Jedi ideals are correct, and he was looking at this as his tool. This teaming up with Palpatine temporarily was his way to effectively destroy the Jedi Order so he could rebuild it from the ground up and have it be pure and good again. And that's why he tries to recruit Obi-Wan Kenobi, because he sees Obi-Wan as one of the last good Jedi, and then when Obi-Wan's like, dude, what the hell?
Yeah.
Then that's when things start to like slide off the rails a bit.
And I'll say there is definitely some headcanon there, but I think that that's a pretty legit headcanon. Especially because obviously the Clone Wars happens after Count Dooku has already fallen, but we get a lot more of his backstory, and I think it's through flashbacks. But yeah, we learn a lot. We see a lot more of like what Count Dooku was like when he was a Jedi and when he was still part of the Republic. And like you said, yeah, he didn't seem evil at that point. He seemed like he had some really legitimate arguments with the Jedi and with their ideals. And again, there's another show I would love to see if Disney Plus could do. I'd love to see something about, Count Dooku and like how he becomes who he becomes and how, because you're right, if it is, to me, the story is boring if he's just an mustache twirling Sith who just wants to take over because that's what the Sith want.
Yeah, and like we've established, there are a lot of legitimate gripes with the Jedi, and he could be the one who is like, no, you guys are like doing this the wrong way. You guys are compromising in areas you should not compromise.
Yeah. I think that's brilliant. I've never heard that before. But yeah, and especially if his idea is eventually that he's going to turn on Palpatine and be like, no, the Sith are terrible. But we couldn't fight the Sith before. Like that, that would have been so good. Especially because then that moment of Luke and, of Anakin and Obi-Wan killing, really Anakin specifically killing Dooku just makes so much more sense.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. All right, well, I think it's probably a good time to call it. Matt, thank you again so much for being a part of this. I really hope, I know we've talked about schedules and you becoming a somewhat regular guest or maybe eventually a kind of partial co-host. We're really exciting. So you get out a lot of great thoughts and would love to hear more of them. And to all you guys who are listening, all you folks who are listening, thank you so much for sticking around for this. We'd love to hear what you have to think. I started this podcast, I'm sure Matt feels the same way, because we don't just want to talk at you, we want to hear your thoughts. We want this to be a conversation. How are you feeling about the Clone Wars TV show? Have you not seen the show and this makes you more excited or less excited to see it? Are there parts of the Clone Wars TV show that we didn't get to if you were a big fan of it or if you hated it? Let us know. Dive into the conversation with us. And especially, I hope this is for people who haven't seen it or people who just want to see it again, inspired you to, if you're going to be on Disney Plus, maybe to, give it a rewatch, and then follow us along when we do our rewatch ourselves. And for anyone else, please just let us know what you're thinking. You can find us on both Facebook and on Twitter at, Star Wars Universe Podcast. You can also email us, starwarsuniversepodcast@gmail.com. And I'll include in the show notes links to all those. You can just click on those pretty easily. And I'll also say, if you're a fan of the kind of ideas I've had to have, please check out my other podcasts, Superhero Ethics and the Orville Cinematic Universe podcast, as well as some of the great podcasts that the people who I am kind of connected with are also doing. The Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Star Trek Universe podcast, the DC On Screen Universe podcast. There's a lot of really good ones out there. The Who Watched the Watchmen, which is a new one that's been launched by a couple of those people as well. A lot of great podcasts to check out, and especially if you're the kind of people who like Matt and I, love to just take a piece of media and really dive into it and look at it from all angles. All ones I think you're going to love to check out. So, thank you guys again. Please, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you share it with people. We're just getting this podcast off the ground. We'd love to get the word out more. If you're so inclined, please leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. That's a great way for people to up our algorithms and get more people paying attention to us. So, on behalf of myself and the podcast and Matt, thank you guys all for being a part of this. Have a good day.